Welcome back to Power Lunch with myself, Byron Kennedy. Before the break, you would have heard the views of Trevor Manuel, our Finance Minister, on the savings environment in South Africa. In the studio now, we're joined by Bruggemans, the Chief Economist at FNB, to get his views, and we'll pick up exactly where we left that interview about the savings culture in South Africa. I did ask our Finance Minister whether government was doing enough to encourage savings. Where do you stand on that particular issue?
Of the three parties in the country that save, business, companies save the most for the simple reason they're motivated by profit, risk and return. Compared to households, I think over time, lifestyle has come to dominate, and the temptation of spending is of such a nature that savings tends to become a very distant poor. Or shall we say, the future will look after itself, and we tend to focus on the short term. That's a culture that's difficult to change, extremely difficult to change when we have so much freedom. As a balancing item, the government could try more in its own right. In other words, if we as households don't save enough, the government should be running a larger budget surplus. And I think that would be the easiest answer, compared to trying to wean off us off our spending culture. Is far more difficult.
The breakfast this morning was essentially to promote retail savings bonds in South Africa, but the National Treasury also invites what are called tips for Trevor. Are there any savings schemes or thoughts that you think that the Finance Minister should consider or reconsider?
Well, he has these bonds, which is an old attempt, but no, my imagination has its limitations.
Let's move on and talk about your latest sort of economic research. I did say earlier that the title is SA's Economy is in a Mess, but I believe that's just one of the headlines that a website has come up with, MoneyWeb. They're using a bit of poetic or artistic license. But you do start your piece off by saying, it's a mess. What's a mess and who's to blame?
Well, basically, it is this. Well, the strangeness is that we have this advantage of windfalls coming our way in terms of high commodity prices and good capital inflow still. But it now materializes that this commodity windfall has a toxic side to it. And that is effectively this worldwide rise in prices. That isn't just only income enhancement for us on the export side. It is also increasingly filtering into our inflation indices to a degree that really nobody expected. I mean, 2 years ago, the CPIX was sitting at 3.5. We're now at 9.5. And when one allows for oil and food, the currency, but also Eskom still coming through on electricity charges, you're probably looking at a peak here somewhere in the 12% plus range over the next 3 to 4 months. And that is a very substantial rise, and it leads to interest rate increases. We are sacrificing growth in order to remain on top of our inflation behavior. That is a substantial change from, say, 4 or 5 months ago.
You put on record that last week's rate hike you thought was the right decision, but in what context? That the Reserve Bank needs to get its credibility back, perhaps?
No. It's got nothing to do with credibility as far as I'm concerned. It's got everything to do with what the bank sets out to do, and that is to focus on inflationary expectations. Now, so far, the rise in inflation is nearly entirely due to these outside forces that I was referring to: oil, food, the currency, which is primarily an external influence. And of course, then we have our own goal in what is happening to electricity charges. When it comes to the labor market, when it comes to company pricing behavior, so far that has been a very minor contribution to causing the inflation rate to rise. But as inflation has risen and is set to rise further, one can expect defensive reactions. Compensate me for what I'm losing here in real terms. And for that reason, I think the Reserve Bank is prepared to raise interest rates in order to temper that kind of attitude. And under these circumstances, we mustn't be surprised that they are being as disciplined as they are.
But what do you make of the trade unions? They're calling for a drop in interest rates. They're also suggesting that basic food prices should be frozen. In your professional judgment, what impact would moves, if they both had to come at the same time, would that have on the economy as a whole?
Yeah, well, those kind of noises very much represent vested interest, their own. There are many vested interests in the economy, and when they make such noises, they actually do not speak on behalf of the general welfare. They speak on behalf of their own priorities. So one should treat it in the manner that it manifests itself. To freeze prices is not a good idea because it merely stores up trouble. And to keep or to cut interest rates, in other words, not to accept this kind of discipline, would simply allow the indiscipline of the inflation to ultimately filter into the wage and salary demands and the price changes that we're seeing. We would be embedding a much higher inflation rate, and over time that would be very costly in many respects.
How should government be tackling rising food prices? Trevor Manuel widely quoted over the weekend suggesting that sustainable farming is the answer. Do you think that's practical?
By all means, but I think it's part of the answer. The reality of the matter is that we have a worldwide change in relative prices. It is being distorted on the supply side by perhaps poor conditions in some countries, but it is primarily being distorted by the high oil price and the biofuel demand, and by the way, by the manner in which so many emerging markets are getting richer and have a higher protein demand. So we're having a change in international supply and demand. It gives rise to higher relative prices, and we should absorb that. The good news, of course, especially for the farming community, which for a long time suffered relatively low prices, is that they are getting a better deal under these circumstances.
In your piece, you also talk about the risk of another major rand shock. Just how likely or how serious a threat is that of a recurrence of the magnitude that we saw in 2001?
Well, this time it hasn't happened to us, it has happened to somebody else, to whom it has happened before as well, in our company, and the country is Iceland. Now, that is hardly an emerging market, it is far away from here, totally different characteristics from us, but we have something in common, which is a very large current account deficit, in their case far larger than ours. But the point is that they were ultimately singled out in recent weeks and months, and have had substantial pressure on them. It reminds of what we experienced in 2001, and I think it makes the policymakers careful.
Just to finish off with, there's at least one economist that thinks there's a 50% chance that South Africa will slide into recession. Trevor Manuel says there's no need to panic. Which way are you leaning towards?
We certainly are trying for a bottom. We don't know where the bottom is at this point in time. But to dip in recession, I think you need a lot more things going wrong than what so far has happened.
Cees Bruggemans, that's where we're going to have to leave it, I'm afraid. He is the Chief Economist at FNB, and that's all for Power Lunch today in association with MoneyWeb. We're crossing now to CNBC US for US Score Plots, and CNBC Africa back at 4 p.m. Central African Time with Regional Roundup.